This is a Culture Connect broadcast from the Ministry of Spiritology. I am the Interfaith Minister in Kanwe Fokwa Amde, the Director of the Association for Cultural Awareness and the initiator of the Ministry of Spiritology. We want to give this particular segment the highlighting and topic which will fall into three major phases, but we want to use this as our broadcast note sections given to you specifically from an editorial level from the minister's RedPill Diaries. Now, the minister's RedPill Diaries, like I just pointed out, would be more of a feature platform of audio or video recordings which we will be creating for our ministry participants to kind of sample a little bit of, what we might point out are some reflections on some of the discourses which we have in some of our virtual forums and our seminars and personal interactions with some of you as individuals. I'll be giving you some more enlightened, should we say, reflection, meditation, and commentary on particular topics so that you really get a full view of spiritology when you want to perform particular analysis. Now, in this three-part segment, we'll be looking at three topics specifically that we'll be doing discourse on. Racism is an issue that we know with the murder of George Floyd earlier this year. It sparked again this whole, should we say, media postulation in the West, America specifically, of what I call racial identity politics, in which the media focuses on a particular racial issue and, through essentially framing it in the news, priming it and giving it constant repetition as a major headline. It incites the African American and African dominant melanated population in the United States, the diaspora as well, the general world and planet of Black people becomes incited because of such particular media reviews, which ultimately we do see that our people come out in large numbers to protest, and it shows some level of strength and solidarity at affliction because of racial issues. But consistently, we don't see policies changed in this act of, should we say, political pressure against the administration, which dominantly, we have to admit, is founded with a white supremacist ideology and mainstream philosophy in its foundation. The United States is a nation that was built on the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade played a dominant and monumental role in facilitating its advancement as far as construction, laying of railroads, roads. So much infrastructure was built simply because the Caucasian, white, American males were entitled to own and purchase human beings simply because they had dark skin, flesh. And this gave that nation such an advancement. It gave the entire European world, the whole colonial world of Europe and the West, was able to dominate and benefit into the position that it's reached currently today and maintains, because it was able to pillage Africa and still maintains some neo-colonial restraints on the control of resources, the cost of import-export tariffs on particular cash crops, the manipulation of the political governments. We could go on, We don't want to deviate to that. We're looking more in the context of racism and how we're not even deviating when we're talking about this, because we're realizing that racism as a whole structure and its manipulation of the African and the dominant melanated man. In the West, in America, they tried to give the African American the conceptualization that they are different in the whole scheme of what we know as racism and imperialism, so to speak, the fundamentals of capitalism, having a structure of economy in which there is an upper class which is able to maintain that position of business, of free trade, because it is able to exploit a whole different geographic region of the earth, of its ethnic population and its work and labor capital, as per some bogus contracts during the 1960s, maybe 1870s period, which are still being maintained today, through the general inferiority complex of the belief and assumption that people with white skin are superior to people with dominant melanated skin tone. I mean, that falsehood, it is perpetuated through Christianity and its concept and conceptualization of the supreme creator deity espousing the person of Jesus Christ, supposedly being a Caucasian, being a fair-skinned or white-skinned man. You see, God in its manifestation, if it wanted to embody itself in the earth in avatar form, it could of course choose any ethnic background to manifest itself into. So the particularization of the Caucasian in the Jewish tradition of Yeshua, and it's expounding to the world in itself. It's another form of the falsehood of white supremacy. And this whole concept of racism, it's fueled in it, whether it's acted upon the African, the dominant melanated man in the motherland where African people do come from, or whether it's perpetuated against even the dominant melanated man who was taken as a slave across the Atlantic and now considers himself an African American. In quotes, it creates a failure in the formulation of the African nation, essentially, because these individuals, I don't know what to say, these individuals, these people, these members of this ethnic group should see themselves as one and be aspiring in networking across the Atlantic, the formulation of non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations where possible, the forging of business agreements and trade and contracts, African leaders, African companies, African ministries using African American and diasporan architects and engineering and technicians in the development of its infrastructure. You see it. These are the type of relationships we should be playing between the two, which they would give us the fortification and advance we currently need in the situation we are faced with the West and the Asian Chinese influx coming into the country. And it's frightening that we're not recognizing this in this particular domain and time in the evolution of our, should I say, history as an ethnic group. Because we have individuals like Donald Trump, who, as the president of the United States of America, possibly going in for a re-election as we are speaking, with today being November the 2nd, we have to start to pay attention to the fact that his representation of the American status quo as the president, it exhibits the reality to the dominant melanated people that the background of the Senate, the upper house, even the lower house, the individuals who are the movers and shifters and the political pundits in the American political system still hold fast to white supremacist tendencies, essentially. There's still racism permeating the politics, the economics, the social structure of the United States so profusely that even the election of Barack Obama, who is American part Kenyan by his father's heritage, has African descent, that was just more of the media ruse and, racial identity politics, essentially, used to condition the dominant melanated population, not just in America, but on the earth fundamentally, from positioning itself into a self-reliant mind frame in which it does start to focus collectively as a collective consciousness to do for self, focus on developing self, making trade agreements which fully will benefit self, following spiritual cosmology which defines self in the context of its environment and propels it without giving it false representation or representation which is other than itself. You see it. These things are what needs to start coming to light when we would start talking about the idea of combating racism and anti-racism. It's not something that is a dialogue between whites and blacks fundamentally at the end. And that's why this whole concept of defining racism as something that only white people are capable of, it demonstrates once again the inferiority complex which is attached to white supremacy, which the African descendant, the dominant melanated human being, should, at this point in the evolution of our liberation, from our captivity enforced into enslavement in the 1400s by the Portuguese under papal bull and instruction from the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy, till now are still entanglement with the Roman Catholic and descendant denomination traditions and their subconscious mental enslavement of our people with the subliminal manipulations. That in its whole span of creation, before looking at the capitalism and its infrastructure and the manipulations of colonialism to control puppet governments today in neo-colonial form, and the whole structure of imperialism itself as the mechanism of white supremacy, fundamentally still working till today. When we say that all whites are racist, we fail to recognize that the evolution of the Africans' liberation, it's not been necessarily granted only because of our pressure tactics and our capacity to rise up and give threat and political pressure to the white Caucasian supremacist system. Along the lines, there have been lobbyists within their framework and ethnic grouping that do recognize the fundamental reality of the falsehood of white supremacy and thus stand forward amongst their people to lobby against it and to say that we don't recognize such individuals is it's fallacy and it's illogical. We cannot say that we don't recognize socialist organizations in Eastern Europe, in South America, amongst the Latin countries. You see, even as far as into Asia, that have been monumental in supporting a lot of pro-liberation movements in the African context, which have stood in opposition to certain capitalistic forms which would deprive totally the indigenous people of the rights to even the remotest increments of benefits from their natural resources and wealth in the whole economic game. And like I'm trying to point out, the whole creation of this concept that all whites are racist, and they are racist in the fact that they have power and privilege, which the dominant melanated man does not have. Like I said, it creates this espousement to the dominant melanated man or woman that they do not have power, they do not have privilege. But this is a failure in recognition of the fact that the dominant melanated human being, male or woman, comes from a continent and a long legacy of, should we say, evolution, which at its political, economic, social, and spiritual levels even was able to define the current pace of civilization and has tested time immemorial for thousands of years, millions of years even, and it in itself cannot be disregarded. And that alone gives the dominant melanated human being the right of way and recognition to fit into the continued scheme of the evolution of human civilization without accepting such definitions which categorically continue to represent some form of an inferiority complex. I think it's necessary that we do come away from this way of looking at reality. By having his own continent, which he has thrived in for millions of years, and she has cultivated the soil and raised the human populations in their various kinds, the dominant melanated human being, the African, assuredly has power and privilege upon the earth in having already chosen the choicest portion of its continental landmass for his and her inhabitants. So, ending on that note with this concept of racism, let's use that as our reflection in looking at the world and understanding that between the various ethnic groupings as they have been codified by the Germans and their de-evolved system, their de-evolved classification of human beings, which Blumenbach and the rest from the 18th century, we don't want to digress into that. We find ourselves in the confusion today. We recognize 100% that whether black skin or white skinned or yellow or red or brown, we are all children of this universe. We are all equal. That's not something that must be disputed and brought into any controversy. And when that is failed to be understood, whether it's at the national level or the tribal level or the racial level or the gender level or even the economic level, because there's more of class stratification according to the lines of wealth than there is race for those people who are actually conscious of the reality of the way the world is set up. And